We are on Daf Kuf Lam and Hey on the base, a few lines from the bottom. The Gemara is going to address a question about the life, the status of a child being a stillborn versus being born alive. Even when a child is born alive, if they cannot survive, they are considered stillborn halachically. That is, as we mentioned a few days ago, children born in the 8th month and sometimes in the 7th month had no viability, could not survive, and were considered stillborn even though they were breathing as they were born. They could not survive, and therefore were considered a stillborn. At what point does one know that a child was born, and on the basis of where they're up to, they will be considered having survived? If they live a day, if they live 2 days, if they live a week. So the Gemara is going to tell us at first that for a human, it'll take 30 days before we know that they are considered a living being and not a stillborn. The Gemara is going to challenge that and ultimately discuss what are we talking about when we say 30 days. Is that when we know for sure the child was full term? Or are we talking about when we don't know if the child is full term, or when we know the child is not full term? And is there already a suffix, a doubt, and therefore 30 days tells us that the child, having survived, is considered a living child, or and before that would be considered a stillborn? There are many halachic ramifications to this question. I'll take it to the nth degree so that we can understand. The capital punishment for a murderer in the Torah is only if the child was a viable being, and therefore a stillborn or a non-viable child, even alive, even breathing, would while murder would not be capital punishment. And so when it says 30 days after it takes 30 days for a child to be considered a viable child, is that every child? Only when we know that the child was not in full term, or when or we know for sure it was in the 8th month, or even when there's a doubt.
Okay, so you just said if we know for sure that it's in the 8th month, and in a few places in the Gemara, we talk about a case where a woman was married and then either the husband died or they got divorced, and that she has to wait 3 months because otherwise it could be that we don't know if a 7th month birth is actually a 9-month birth from the first husband or not. Why here do we not say that maybe there's a suffix? How do we know? How do we know that it's 8 months? Maybe it's not 8 months. Maybe it's a 9 month, and we just counted wrong, or there was another man involved.
How would somebody know for sure?
Yeah, you just
said together once 8 months ago.
Okay, so that's the case then. It's not just.
I mean, I think I'm in the many ways of. I mean, it's knowable, and that's the question. Are we talking when we discuss over here whether the child is viable, whether the child's considered alive or a stillborn? Is that only when we know for sure it's an 8th month baby, or anytime there's a doubt, or even when we know it's full term? That we'll see.
Okay, but suffix pikuach nefesh, I'm assuming is we're gonna do whatever it takes.
Sure, if we think that we can save the child, for sure, and that's why today, even a 25 week, even a 20 week, we take him to hospital. We do whatever we can, even though back then it was totally not viable. But today there are babies that survive. So we're 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Lam and Hey on base 135b. Tanya Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Loimer. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, "Kosher shah lamed yom ba'adam ein nefel." If a child after birth is alive for 30 days and survives, that tells us it's not a nefil, it's not a stillborn. Shenemar, it says it's as it says that in regards to Pidyon Aben, the redemption of the firstborn son, that the redemption is done after 30 days. So we see it takes 30 days to know that the child is actually alive. And similarly, by an animal, it would take 8 days to know that it's not a stillborn. For it says that from the 8th day on, the animal can be a carbon. Tues points out over here that 30 days is actually the 31st day is when we know, because it's after the 30 days. Whereas by the animal, it's the 8th day, so it's after 7 days, not after 8 days. It's not comparable counting here, but nevertheless, that's the way it's lined up because of the way that the wording in the Torah. But if not for waiting 8 days, not the 8th day or 30 days to the 31st day, we are in a state of doubt of whether or not this child can survive or not. So that's the basis of the halacha that Rav Shimon Gamliel teaches. Now we have a question. Well, if that's the case, how do we do a bris on the 8th day? Kuflam and Vavam and Aleph, we are on 136a. So how do we do a bris on a child like this? After all, it may not survive 30 days, and you're doing a bris on Shabbos, which will essentially be breaking Shabbos. You're breaking Shabbos for a child that is not would not survive or may not survive. Amar Rabbi Rava says, why? Big deal. So we do a bris. Im chayhu, if he does survive, Shapek Hamayil. So it was a live birth, and therefore he deserves a bris. We do the bris for him. The im lav, and if it does not survive, that means that it was a stillbirth retroactively. Well, then it was doing surgery to a cadaver. The Gemara, interestingly, does not take into account that maybe this would be causing the early birth, the early death, and it could have survived 30 days without the bris, but the bris is what caused it. Gemara doesn't consider that. Well, the Gemara asks another question. Hadatanya, Suffolk ben Zayin, Suffolk ben Ches. We learned earlier that if there's a doubt whether the child was born in the 7th month or 8th month, and interestingly, we mentioned then that a child in the 8th month has a difficulty, is much less likely to survive than the 7th month. And so if if the child is for sure in the 8th month, then it's not viable at all. In the 7th month, could be it's viable, and we don't know if this is 7th or 8th month. So ein mechal nafas Shabbos. We don't break Shabbos for this child to do the bris. Amai. Why not? Nimali. Why don't we say do the bris and the same calculation that Rabbi Barabba just said? Big deal. Do the bris. Manavshach. Either way, it's okay. If it's a living being and doing the circumcision, doing the bris is going to cause it to bleed, and by causing it to bleed, you're taking part of its soul, and that's prohibited on Shabbos, as Rashi explained what the problem of chabura, of making a wound. So this is a mitzvah, so you're allowed to make the wound. Shapra kamayil, therefore it's a good bris. The imlav, and if it does not survive, so big deal. Machatich bebasaru. You just do it. You're not taking the soul. You're cutting into a cadaver. Amar mar bereder avina anav nechunim ad Zechariah targimna mimel hachinami malina. So he says that we explain it this way: that of course you do a bris to such a child, and there's no question that you would do a bris for a child that was born in the 7th month, the child may be born in the 8th month, the child that's born in the 9th month, and we don't know whether it'll survive. Yeah, you do a bris, as you said, because it's not going to, either way, it'll be fine. If you do it on if the child survives, great. So you did a bris, and you didn't break Shabbos because it was a mitzvah. And if the child does not survive, so it's essentially a stillborn that's still breathing, and you're cutting into a cadaver, which is not taking the soul, which is going to be permissible on Shabbos. And the entire discussion in the previous Mishnah that talks about a baby in the 7th month, 8th month, 9th month, that's talking about Rabbi Eliezer, who told us that not only are you allowed to do the bris, but you're also allowed to do all the prep work. You're allowed to make a knife and carry the knife, etc., in order to get to the bris. Well, that we said, that you can't do because you don't know if the child is a stillborn and does not survive. You're carrying for a non-mitzvah, and that you can't do. Even though he says you can do machshira mitzvah, the prep work for a mitzvah can also be done on Shabbos, but the mitzvah has to be there. I'll leave it, Rabbi Lezer. I'm Abaye Ketanai. So Abaye says, actually, we have a machlokas tanaim of whether or not, even in a stillborn, since it's breeding, do we consider it that it is just cutting into a cadaver, or is it really actually for right now it's alive, and therefore since it's breathing, even though that it cannot survive, but for as long as it's alive, doing anything to it would constitute taking a life, and therefore it's prohibited on Shabbos. As we have a machlokas tanaim based on the brayso. It says there are two concepts in the Torah as far as animals that are not kosher animals, kosher species that are not kosher to eat on account of the way they died. And there's nevela and terefa. Nevela is where it died either by its roadkill or natural causes, and did not die by shechita, by proper halachic slaughter. Nevela has a tumah that's caused to the person, and when they eat it, or even carry it sometimes, right? So there's a tumah that comes to a person by nevela. Terefa is where the animal could even be alive, but it cannot survive on its own. And there, even if you shecht it, even if you did the proper slaughter, it will not count as a slaughter, and the animal may not be eaten. But there in terefa, it will, since you shechted it properly, it will not cause tumah. It will not cause tumah to the person that eats it or carries it. So it says, so if this animal dies that is permissible to be eaten, and it dies, so what is that talking about? It tells us that if it's within the 8 days of birth, even though you shechted it and you did a proper slaughter, it does not save it and from tumah, and it would cause, essentially is dying by its own causes, and therefore would cause tumah to a person when they eat it. Even though that it may have survived, but was within 8 days of its birth, and therefore it's as if it died on its own causes, and it will cause a tumah. And we see that from the fact that it says, Ashehi lachem la'achla, that is permissible to be eaten. That means you were already allowed to eat it. But within the 8 days, you're not allowed to eat it. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, shchitase v'tarasi, and they say no. The shchita does save it from tumas nevela. It takes it out of the category of nevela and takes it into treifa. My laba can be palgi. When we say this is the basis of machlokes, the marsav chayu, one says that the animal is a living being, and therefore when you shecht it, the shchita works, even though it's within the 8 days and it may still be a stillborn. But nevertheless, the shechita worked, and so essentially, the shechita worked to take it out of the category of dying by its own causes and by natural causes, and is not nevela, but rather it's in the category of terefa, which is a lesser degree, if you would, of dead animal, in as much as that it doesn't cause tumah. Omar Savar Mesu, and the first opinion said no, this animal is a stillborn and considered dead until such time that we know 8 days passed, and therefore when you shechted it, you were cutting into a cadaver, and it was already dead by its own natural causes and would cause tumah. Amar Rava, so Rava said to Abaye, well, if that's the case, why are they arguing about if it's a live being? So why are they arguing whether it's tummy or not? It shouldn't be tummy at all, and in fact, it should also be permissible to be eaten because you're saying the animal's alive, and it was shechted. So great, so that it should be just and the shechita worked, so it should be a valid to be eaten. It should be kosher food. Ella the kula alma mesu. Rather, everybody considers it dead. And the reason why they say that there's no tuma to such an animal, sabrika trefa, because they compare it to terefa, and just as to terefa, the terefa does not cause tuma, so to this, there's no tuma. Terefa lav afagav the mesi, because a terefa has a hole in the heart. That's considered dead. Essentially, even though it's walking around, it cannot survive, and so it has, in a certain sense, already its pronouncement as a dead being. But yet, if you shecht it, it will save it from the tumah. Hachanami lishna. So too over here, there's no difference. Rabbanan and the Rabbanan who disagree with that say, "Lo dami l'treifa." It's not comparable to treifa on account of the treifa. Kosher. The treifa was a kosher animal that got an injury or an ailment and therefore became invalid, and it cannot survive, and therefore is considered mace. Hi, kosher. But the infant, the calf that was born. And just born, and we don't know whether it can survive or not. That never had a state of kosher, and then became ill. We don't know whether it ever was alive, and therefore it is considered an avail. Well, what about a terefa, a child, a calf that was born terefa? So there are certain limbs that are missing that you are considered a terefa right from the birth. And so if it's born a terefa, the halacha is still that if you shecht it, it's not tamei, and it would never had a time that it was permissible to be eaten. It was never considered kosher at any moment, because from its birth it was already terefa. It's true that that particular scenario doesn't have a valid shchita ever, but nevertheless the concept of terefa has a valid shchita, and therefore there's no tuma even in that case, because it's a general case of terefa. All terefa has the same halacha on the basis of usually it would have had a time that it was kosher to be eaten. Not so for a nefel, a stillborn. All stillborns, by definition, never had a time that they were kosher. And therefore, shchita would never be a valid form for such a stillborn for such a case. So now the Gemara is going to analyze and say, okay, fine. So we're talking about within 8 days, within 30 days, this fetus is in a state of doubt of whether or not, this baby or the calf is in a state of doubt of whether it's stillborn and really never left its status as fetus and came into a living being, or do we say it did? Do the Rabbanan disagree with the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? This that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said that we always have 30 days. It takes 30 days to the 31st day for a human to be out of doubt, and same for an animal. Do the Rabbanan agree to that, or do they disagree with that? And intim tzalei pligi halacha kamoisei and halacha kamoisei. And if they disagree, do we go the majority that disagree, or do we accept the halacha of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, since the Brisa quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel doesn't even have a opposing opinion? Tashema. So we're going to try and prove it from here. A calf that was born on Yantif, you could shecht it on Yantif. Now wait, if you could shecht it on Yantif, there's a muksa question. it was born today. So then we say, no, it was not muksa because the mother could have been shechted, so it was not a muksa. But what about it was just born? Maybe it's a stillborn. How can you shecht it? So you see that the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel because there's an opinion here that on the day that the calf was born, you're allowed to shecht it and eat it. So the muksa part, we understand it's not a muksa on account of since at the onset of Yontif, the mother was allowed to be shechted. So too the calf that was in it was allowed to be shechted. But now that it's born, you shouldn't be allowed to shecht it on account of that it's not yet past the 7 days. It's not in the 8th day, and so you wouldn't be allowed to eat it anyhow because maybe it's a stillborn, and so shechting it would be for naught.
Wait, you wouldn't be allowed to eat it, or you wouldn't be able.
You wouldn't be allowed to eat it because maybe it was a stillborn.
You wouldn't be allowed to bring it as a korban, but who says you couldn't eat it?
No, maybe it's a stillborn, so it could be an avela. We just said that it would be either an avela or terem. You wouldn't be allowed to eat it. So Gemara says, so here the Gemara introduces that what we spoke about at the beginning. Now, here this would be even according to Rishon ben Gamliel, who said that you need to wait 30 days or for a human or 7-8 days for a calf. However, that's talking about what we don't know was full term. Here, where we know was full term, so then it's a live being as at the moment of birth. Tashama, similarly, we learned the halacha for a firstborn calf, for a bechor, is that it has to be given to the kohen. If it has a blemish, then the owner of the animal is allowed to eat it, allowed to shecht it. It belongs to them. If it has a wound, an injury, etc. So typically, you would have to have someone knowledgeable in these halachos come and check it out and make sure that indeed it doesn't have to be given to the kohen. It's allowed to be kept by the farmer, and that can't be done on Yantiv, and so it would not be an animal that's muchan, that's prepared for Yantiv. However, if it was born that way, and at the birth there were people who knew the halacha that were there, and saw it and can immediately pronounce, oh, this is a bechor mum, and therefore is edible, belongs to the owner. Therefore, even for Yantiv, it'll be prepared and muchan. Again, it's allowed to be used on Yantiv that day because it doesn't have to be given to the kohen. But what we see is that it can be shechted for food on Yantiv, even though it was born. You don't have 8 days from its birth. So too over here, we're going to say even Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would agree on account of that Kollel chadashav. This animal was full term, and we know it's full term, and therefore it's there's no doubt, there's no state of doubt of whether it's a stillborn or not. Tashamad, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Amar Shmuel, in the name of Shmuel, Allah Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The halacha is indeed like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So by saying the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, we can infer two things. Both answers to the question. One, one's not an inference, but we can infer that there is a machlokas, that the Chachamim disagree, because otherwise you don't have to say the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. That's the only statement we know. So by the fact you say halacha like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, meaning that there were those that disagreed. But nevertheless, the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and that tells us that even though that the Chachamim disagree, the halacha is like this single opinion, and that's why it's counted in the brisa as a single opinion. Halacha mechlal da pligi. So that's good proof that both of the answers, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and even though there's a disagreement. Amar Abaye, Nafa min agag ochle ari. If an animal fell off the roof, or it got eaten by a lion, so even though that it happened within 30 days of birth, if it's an animal within 7 days, in the 8 days of birth, or within the 7 days, or for a human within the 30 days. Since it didn't die on its own, something else caused its death. So Abaye says everybody would agree that would count, that if we consider it having been born alive and survived, and the other external factor that caused its death is the reason for its death. And the Gemara is going to introduce over here another concept that for why this would be important. The halacha is we're going to learn the concept of yibum. If a man dies childless, his widow, his marriage to his wife, now his widow, it transfers to his brother, who will then has a mitzvah to establish his household for him. Now, if he did have a child, even if the child died in infancy or as a child, and therefore he has no surviving children, but he had a child, so that would mean that there is no transfer of his marriage. There's no chalitza needed in order for her to be able to marry anyone else. But if the child if he never had a surviving child, then she cannot marry anyone she wants to until she gets chalitza. She gets the process of dissolving the zika, which is a term for the transferred marriage from the deceased brother to the surviving brother. So now we have a question. We have she had given birth to a child, but that child tragically died within 30 days of birth, but not by itself, but by some other external factor. Fell off the roof, or wild animal ate it, or whatever it may be. So that could, if we consider that a living birth, even though it never passed 30 days, and so we don't know for sure that it would have survived. So maybe it was a stillbirth, but nevertheless, Abaye says everybody would agree when there was an external factor that killed this child, we are going to assume the child would have survived the 30 days and is not considered a stillbirth, and therefore would exempt the mother from chalitza and from yibum, and when the father of this infant that died so tragically is going to pass away, that marriage would not transfer to the brother because she's not a yavama. She is not in this category of yibum. Rather, the deceased brother, having had a child that was born alive, would not transfer the marriage to the surviving brother. So there's no yibum. This is the concept of even though that the child did not survive 30 days, we assume that it was a live birth. That's what Abaye is saying. So any external death to this infant within 30 days will not negate the live birth, and would not even put a doubt into the live birth.
He has to have an heir?
Sorry?
He has to have an heir, is that correct?
No. He has to have had a live child. He doesn't have to have a surviving year. So, again, I'm not buying up. Sorry? Yeah, something there?
I'm trying to remember how it works. We'll get there.
It works the way we just said, that if you look at Rashi, Nafal Mina Gag, it's clear there. That as long as the child survived, as long as there was a living child, even if at the time of that the yibum would have happened, the child's no longer alive, but that's considered a live birth enough that the chalitza or yibum is not necessary or is not allowed. There's no mitzvah there. There's no transference of the deceased brother's marriage because he did have a child, and it's only if the person was completely childless that this would not cause a yibum. We'll see more about this in Yavamas, but for now, this is the sufficient. That what we're looking for over here is that if this infant died within 30 days, if Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is straight up the halacha that we would say within 30 days, it's a doubt. So then she would not be allowed to marry anybody she wanted. We would need a chalitza because maybe they never had a live child. Abai is telling us that everybody would agree, even Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would agree that having had this live birth and the child dying from some external factor would not negate the live birth, and therefore they had a child, or primarily the idea is that he had a child, and when he died, the deceased brother does not transfer his marriage over to the surviving brother. Whereas the machlokes, where the child struggled to breathe and then died. Marsavar chayu. What the Chachamim say, so what? But it breathed, it was alive, and therefore it's considered a live birth. And Marsavar mesu. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, that child, even though that it survived for a bit, but since it struggled to breathe, that would not be a living being. Now, l'maynaf kamina, leftor min hayibum. What difference does it make? Either way, it didn't survive 30 days, so there's no mitzvah of pidyon haben, because that only happens on the 31st day. What ramifications does this have? The ramification we just said of exempting the mother from yibum and saying no, she could just marry anyone she wants as a widow.
She couldn't become his. I mean, she'd have to do chalitza. She couldn't marry the brother in Suffolk.
Well, no, it doesn't need either. It's considered a live birth. You're saying what would have been the halacha? What are we excluding? What are we coming lafutin? Correct. There would be no yibum. Of course, so Michael's pointing out an important point. We'll see more of this when we get to Yavamas, but essentially, to marry a sister-in-law, even a widow, the widow of one's brother, would be prohibited. It's an erva in the Torah, and we're not allowed to have such a marriage, unless there's this mitzvah to reestablish the household of the deceased brother. And so if there's a doubt whether the mitzvah is there or not, of course they could not marry for the mitzvah because we don't know whether the mitzvah is there. And if there's no mitzvah, it's actually a prohibition, a severe prohibition of erva, of a prohibited marriage. So you couldn't do that on account of maybe this was a surviving child. Rather, the question was, but maybe she couldn't marry until she got a chalitza, which is essentially the annulment of that marriage that's passed from the deceased brother to the living brother. And maybe that's needed because this is a stillborn. To that, the Gemara says it's not a stillborn. It's considered a live birth on account of that it survived. And the fact that it didn't survive 30 days, that's an external factor. It fell off the roof, an injury, a wild animal ate it. That does not negate the birth being a live birth, and therefore this woman is not doesn't need a chalitza to be able to marry anyone she wants. She can marry anyone right away because we say there was a live birth.
We go on a chazaka at that point that most babies are viable. He fell off the roof or he got eaten by an animal. So
Abai is saying taking one step further. Saying is limiting the halacha of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that we say that there's a doubt whether or not this child is a living being, only in a case of where the child is struggling to breathe, gasping. But if the child is breathing normally, there's no reason to doubt whether it's a stillborn or not. That's what he's saying. Ki pligi shapiek. The machlokas is only where it's gasping for air. So we don't even need chazaka. Michael, you were saying maybe there's a chazaka, there's an established norm that we can go by. We don't need that. We can look at the child and assess. And Abai is further limiting the way we understood Rav Shimon Gamliel, saying that it's only in a case where there are factors. We're looking at the child and seeing that it cannot survive or may not be able to survive on account of that it's struggling. That's where we say maybe it was never considered a birth. Well, what about Rav Papa and Rav Huna who came to the son of Rav Idi bar Ravin? And he made they made a barbecue with fresh calf that was shechted on the seventh day of its life. And Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Yeshua said to Rav Idi bar Ravin's son, "Thank you so much for making us such a beautiful feast. However, we can't partake because it didn't. If you had waited before you shechted it until this evening, fine. But you shechted it in the seventh day too early. And if you would have waited till the evening, we would have eaten it. But now we can't eat from it because you shechted it within the eighth day. So why were they concerned about it? Who said that there was any that this calf was struggling to breathe? According to what Abai is saying, it's only in a case where where there's a struggle to breathe that we say, well, it's not that's a stillborn, or maybe a stillborn. It's not a live birth. Rather, what we say is that if the infant or the calf struggled to breathe and then actually died, everybody would agree that that's a stillbirth, even though it survived a little bit, but it never really survived into a state of health. But rather, machlokes is in a case where an external factor caused its death. Mesu. One says, well, that is considered that's considered it never made it to the finish line. It never made it to the eighth day. It never made it to the 30th day, and therefore it's considered dead because it's stillborn. It's stillborn unless it makes it past that the 30 day or eighth day. And Rav Shimon, the Chachamim say, no, that's already a living being on account of that it never that we don't know that it died from the struggle of breathing. But of course, if a child never really was stable, struggled to breathe, and then died, that's a stillbirth. Bereder Rav Dimi bar Yosef is Yalehu Yenuka b'Gaitlasi Tosi Yamishachit. Rav Dimi, the son of Rav Dimi, had a child that passed away within 30 days. And so he sat shiva on this child. Now, if it was a stillbirth, you don't sit shiva. So why are you sitting shiva? You know the halacha. You're looking for the meal for us to make you meals. We'll make you meals, but you don't have to sit shiva. He says, no, I know that it was a full term birth, and therefore I'm sitting shiva because it's not a stillbirth. So that contradicts this last statement, in as much as at least by a full term child, 30 days is not necessary in order to define it as a live birth. Rav Ashi Ikla Bei Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi came to Rav Kahana's house, Israeli Milsa, and he had a death in his family, with a child that within the first 30 days of life. And he saw that he was sitting shiva for him. Don't you follow Shmuel, who said the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, that within 30 days it's a doubt whether or not it would have survived? Again, he said the same thing, that Kollel we see that this child was full term. So that tells us this. One, if it's full term, there's no doubt. That's considered a live birth at the moment of birth. If it was struggling to breathe and then died, that's considered a stillbirth. Because if the machlokas was even in regards to a case like that where it was struggling to breathe, so then he should have said this child wasn't struggling to breathe. And since he didn't say that, we see that the halacha that too everybody agrees would not be a valid birth. The machlokas is where it's not struggling to breathe, but we're not sure whether or not it's a full-term birth, and we don't know whether it is in the 8th month where really it cannot survive. That's where you need 30 days in order to establish that it is a live birth. Itmar, it was taught, Mace, within 30 days, this woman gave birth to her deceased husband's child. So Reuven dies childless, but his wife's pregnant. So there's no the surviving brother does not do yibum, obviously, because maybe he has he left offspring. This woman gives birth, and she sees that it's a viable child, and immediately within a week or two gets married, thinking, oh, I don't need chalitza, I don't need to annul the deceased brother's marriage that's transferred to the living brother because there's an offspring. And then after she marries, this infant dies. So Amar Ravina Meshmei Rava said in the name of Rava, Me'eshes Yisrael he chaletzas. If she the marriage that she remarried after this child was born was to a Jew, to a regular Yisrael, meaning a non-Kohen, so then she gets chalitza done at that point. Imeshes Kohen, however, if she's married to a Kohen, Eino chaletzas, she does not need chalitza. Now, why would this be necessary? Since we don't know, since this child died, we don't know whether it's a nefel or not, whether it's a stillbirth or a live birth. If it was a live birth, she's not in the category of yibum. However, if it was a stillbirth, she is in the category of yibum. And now she went ahead and married someone else, and we're in a state of doubt. So if it's a regular Yisrael, so then go ahead and do chalitza, even though she's married already to this other man. It's not going to interfere with that marriage because the Yisrael is allowed to be married to a woman who had chalitza. However, a Kohen may not marry a divorcee. Similarly, a Kohen may not marry someone who had chalitza done to them. That's essentially, and the reneging of that marriage, the removal of that marriage is essentially a form of gerushin, a form of divorce, and therefore the Kohen may not marry such a woman. If we now go ahead and do chalitza, that's going to put a place of doubt in the marriage to this Kohen. And so the first opinion says we're not going to do chalitza in that case, even though there's a doubt whether or not she needed chalitza. But at this point, it's too late. We can't put a doubt on the new marriage on account of the doubt of whether it was allowed or not. However, Rav Shravia Mishmei de Rava Amar, Rav Shravia says in the name of Rava, Achazu v'achazu chaletzas. In both cases, she's required to get chalitza even from a Kohen. Yes, it's true that it'll put a damper on the marriage with the Kohen because maybe they're not allowed to be married, but there's also a doubt whether they were allowed to be married in any case. Amalei Ravina Rav Shravia, Ba'urta Marava. It's true in the evening, that's what Rava said. However, Litzafra Hadarbe. But in the morning, he retracted his opinion because in the morning he came to the academy and he taught that that by a Kohen you don't do the chalitza. You only by a regular Yisrael you do the chalitza after she's already married to this other man. Amalei Shur Yusiyeh Rava Tishru Tarbo. So whoa, he came out with a big leniency. Seems like next he's going to permit eating of chalev, of prohibited fats. In other words, that was not a correct retraction. Rava should have stuck with the prohibition and of continuing the marriage until she gets a chalitza, because we're in a doubt whether or not she ever was exempt from chalitza. So this ends the conversation of this state of doubt that exists for a child, for an infant after birth. We know that if the infant struggled to breathe and then passed away, for sure it counts as a stillbirth and not a live birth. If we know for sure the child was viable and had a full-term birth, that it is a live birth. But if it's some place in between, there's a machlokas over here whether or not this counts as a live birth, or there's a doubt of whether it's a stillbirth or not. And according to Rosh Gamliel, which the halacha is, it would be in a place of doubt, and this woman would need a chalitza on account of that maybe her marriage did pass to the brother because the birth was not a valid birth, not a live birth. If she remarried to someone else already, we have, and that person's a kohen, there's a machlokas of whether we would do chalitza or not.
Wouldn't there need to be like some element of doubt? In other words, I mean, what I asked before about chazaka, I mean, we wouldn't assume just because it's a baby and just because we don't know, so maybe the baby wouldn't have been viable. I mean, don't we have a chazaka that most babies are viable?
Yeah,
there would have to be something. We saw the baby was not quite right. The baby was this. The baby was that. We weren't sure about the month, but there has to be something.
So Tosos comes in. Tosos, this lengthy Tosos on Amud Aleph, is coming to say not what you're saying. That it doesn't have to be that we specifically are concerned that maybe it's in the 8th month or we have a specific doubt. It would seem that even if there isn't a specific doubt, other Rishonim say they know that it's talking about with a specific doubt. Like what you're saying, that look, if we don't have any reason to assume that it's a stillbirth, we have no reason to assume the child is non-viable, and it's viable. Tosos is saying no, that the Gemara seems to put the two extremes where there's absolutely a concern. It cannot breathe on its own. It's struggling to breathe. That's a stillbirth. It absolutely is a full-term birth. That's fine. And anywhere in between is a doubt. And that's why I was that way on account of the cases. But there definitely are opinions that say, like what you're saying, Michael, that it would have to have a basis for the doubt in order for us to consider it nafil, or at least a doubt.